Welcome back to People Do Want to Know podcast. I am regrettably sick, but show must go on, so bear with me. Today, I have the greatest privilege of introducing you to someone Jew should absolutely know, which is Mickey Bergman. Mickey is the CEO of Global Reach and the VP and Executive Director of the Richardson Center for Global Engagement. He also teaches emotional intelligence and negotiations at Georgetown University. Even if you don't recognize Mickey by name, you surely know his work. Mickey has advocated for and successfully helped release numerous political prisoners and hostages, including Paul Whelan, Brittney Griner, Otto Warmbier, and Gilad Shalit. He has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize twice. He is just a huge figure in modern history and politics, so the fact that I was able to get him on the podcast feels like a major accomplishment. Of course, Mickey has also worked tirelessly to help release our hostages that are still in Gaza today, which we discussed with him on the episode. He has also written a book titled In the Shadows, True Stories of High-Stakes Negotiations to Free Americans Captured Abroad. Talking to Mickey has been one of the most impactful episodes I've ever done in the history of this podcast. For how accomplished and just important Mickey is to our generation, he's the most humble, down-to-earth guy. I genuinely felt like I could ask him anything, and that he wouldn't hold it against me. He's really patient and eager to help people learn and understand, which is why I also think it's good that he's a professor. Now, the funny part is that for how much of a skilled negotiator he is when it comes to his work, he said that he never negotiates anything small, and that it's always his wife that will go into the car dealership to negotiate, and Mickey's not even allowed to go in because he just won't advocate for himself. I found that kind of a funny part of his personality, and it came up because I told him that I'm the person that negotiates literally everything. I never let anyone off the hook. Even in a restaurant, I always come in and right away ask for a better table. To me, it's like a game. For Mickey, of course, negotiation is a lot more serious and does not have this lighthearted, gamified association to it necessarily. Now, in this episode, we talk about Mickey's career, his work, the Israel-Hamas war, and the hostages. We get through a lot of different topics. Emotional intelligence, too. This is your disclaimer that we will be discussing difficult topics, such as what to do about the hostages. But before we dive in, I wanted to walk you through what I understood as the crux of the issue with the remaining hostages in Gaza today. Specifically, what are the arguments for and against taking a ceasefire deal that would bring the hostages home? Mickey's job is to negotiate on behalf of the hostage families and bring the hostages home. He will tell you more about this himself, but he definitely feels that Bibi could have signed a deal already and brought them all home, but he has chosen not to. This is also in line with the criticism that we hear from the left of center folks, Democrats in the US, etc. In the episode, Mickey walks us through point by point why a deal should have been secured, but the main message is, so long as the deal is not existentially threatening the state of Israel, it's worth taking. In that scenario, we get the hostages back and can resume dealing with Hamas after we've released them. More importantly, he says that we shouldn't fight this war off the backs of our civilian hostages. Now, because I happen to know a lot of people who don't support a ceasefire deal, I wanted to kind of dig to find out what the argument against a deal is. This usually applies to more right-of-center and conservative Americans. Mickey is obviously very compelling and an expert on this, so I wanted to understand what would be the strongest arguments against what Mickey is saying. From my understanding, for those people who are against a deal, the thinking is as follows. Unfortunately, the Israel-Hamas war has evolved to be about more than just bringing the hostages home. It's about the total eradication of Hamas and threat to Israel. In the past, Israel has never taken it all the way. They have always negotiated, created ceasefires, etc. And it has created the precedent that taking hostages, quote-unquote, works, since Israel is always going to concede and bring them home. Because of this, we need to, once and for all, eradicate Hamas, even if it means that bringing the hostages home is no longer our first priority. We need to ensure that October 7th never happens again, and taking a deal that would release the hostages is once again setting the precedent that Israel is willing to pay a price for hostages. Now, for more observant Jews, there are also precedents in the Talmud about what to do that talked about, for example, how a rabbi was held prisoner and insisted that no deal is made to release him so that it didn't create the precedent that the release of a rabbi costs X in exchange. So in that story, the rabbi was actually imprisoned for the rest of his life, and no deal was struck so that the precedent wouldn't be set. Secondly, there's another component of this viewpoint about exposing Israel to undue risk as a result of taking the deal. For example, at this current time, Israel kind of knows for sure what they have to lose. They have the 101 hostages at risk, plus any soldiers who are fighting against Hamas, give and take. Now, if they sign a deal, Israel gets the hostages back, but what happens as a result of the deal becomes uncertain. Maybe Israel releases Palestinian prisoners as part of the deal, and they end up attacking more Israelis. Maybe the war is prolonged as a result of the deal, and maybe there are just unintended consequences of that deal. The interpretation of Jewish law is that when there's a maybe and there's a for sure, you take the for sure. So by that reasoning, you wouldn't want to take a ceasefire deal, even though, of course, it endangers the hostages. And Mickey talks about this himself too. He says that from the many years of doing this, he has learned that over time, 1, the deals never get any better, and that 2, the more time goes by, of course, the less likely it is that any hostages survive. So at this point, over a year in, anyone who doesn't support a deal now probably is trying to bank on not having to make a deal ever. And they think that Israel will just win the war and end Hamas. Whether that's realistic or not is up to all of us to decide for ourselves. This is why this is a debate and a real ethical dilemma. Now, of course, it's easy to advocate for this side when it's not your son or your daughter or your family or friend that's being held hostage. So it's just important to have compassion for that and realize that these are real human beings. I mean, kids are being held for well over a year that have essentially been sacrificed to win a war. You'll hear Mickey break down his logic on why a deal is imperative. But what I'll say is I think all of us in our guts, we kind of know what feels more ethical to us, whether it's to sign the deal or not. And that's based on our own biases, our own risk tolerance, etc. And just remember that I don't think there's a right answer here because it's very hard to quantify things when human lives are involved. So I hope more than anything that you view this episode as an opportunity to educate yourself on the horrible ethical dilemma that we as Jewish people have at hand. I was also thinking about the Holocaust and what life was like for political prisoners and people in the camps. When World War II was fought, no one was fighting it to release the Jews from the camps. Anyone who was released from the camps was kind of an added bonus, essentially. And when the survivors were liberated, they didn't really belong to a state. So no one was interested in their well-being from a governmental level. And that's why many Holocaust survivors ended up having even more trauma after the Holocaust, and some even took their lives. And we unfortunately see that today with some of the survivors of the Nova Music Festival. If there's any silver lining at all in this situation, I think it is beautiful that in this war, our focus as Jewish people has been, above all else, the preservation of human life. To us, our hostages are top of mind, and that's because we have the state of Israel. We have a nation state where we can live together and care about each other, and our priority is our people in a way we never could during the Holocaust. So that's something important to think about. Okay, well, this has been quite the intro, and there's only more to uncover, so please enjoy this episode. Mickey is a really special person, and I can't wait for you to hear what he has to say. Hello, Mickey. Welcome to People Do You Want to Know podcast. How are you?
I am doing well. Thank you, Margarita. It's good to be here.
It's great to connect with you. I feel like you're a man that needs no introduction. Your work is known by everyone around the world. Whether they know it's you or not, you are involved. But I have to ask, tell us about yourself. What do you do and how did you get there?
Yeah, I think that most people have no idea who I am. And with the exception of the explosion of the case of Brittney Griner, publicly, very few people knew that this world actually existed, the world of hostages and political prisoners. Who I am a Israeli born that has moved to the United States about 24 years ago, so exactly half of my life. I came to the US chasing a girl, which I guess is typical, but it was a successful chase. She's my wife of 22 years now. I did my undergrad at UCLA, my graduate degree at Georgetown University, and immediately following my graduation, I started on a path that I never really expected in terms of my career and my work. It wasn't a linear path or anything close to it, but it was a path of passion and discovery that led me to do what I do, which is negotiate the release of political prisoners and hostages around the world, not for the government. Very important to know. I don't do this for the government. We're a non-government organization, non-for-profit, and we do this work on behalf of the families of these hostages at their request and at absolutely no cost to them.
Wow, I had no idea that it was at no cost. This is amazing. This is really powerful work.
Yeah, it's the no cost of it. Look, it's difficult. For 17 years, I've done this work with Governor Bill Richardson, who was my mentor, like all of these kind of accolades. But the most accurate description of him was he was my 6-year-old father figure. So he was like a father in many elements, but he definitely was a 6-year-old at times. He passed away last September a year and a half ago, or a year plus ago. And so I was left to carry this work without him, which I've been doing since. But the way I met him was a funny thing. I was out of my graduate degree at Georgetown. I started working for the Clinton Global Initiative. Just when it started in 2005, former President Clinton brought it together. And I was a very junior staffer. And two things happened to me when I worked and experienced the first ever Clinton Global Initiative meeting in 2005. The first thing that happened was that I discovered that the world is bigger than the Middle East. Because my whole life, growing up in Israel, serving in the Israeli military for 6 years, I always assumed that I will focus and work on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the Israeli-Arab conflict. And suddenly I moved to the United States and discovered that the world is bigger. And growing up in Israel, every single world event is seen through the prism of how it impacts Israel and its immediate neighborhood. And that fascinated me, that the world is bigger and there are other things to do. And the second thing, which was even more significant for me, was that President Clinton's philosophy behind the conference was not to have talking heads, but actually to garner the power of non-government entities, whether it's artists, academics, businesses, NGOs, to figure out what it is that we do as civil society in order to tackle some of the world's biggest challenges. And that to me was astonishing, because I realized that the work that I wanted to do, or the influence I wanted to have in international relations, can be done from outside of government. And so I volunteered after the first conference to go to the border of Chad and Sudan. This is 2005, 2006. The Darfur genocide was at the height of it. And I figured I'm going to go and I'm going to interview some refugees, and I'm going to come back and fundraise for my own community, the Jewish community, and apply whatever I raised, $50,000, towards the cause that I deemed most urgent after my visit. And I did that, and I came back and I went to my community, the Jewish community, to raise the funds. And I succeeded. But unbeknownst to me, Governor Bill Richardson at the time was asked by the Save Darfur Coalition to go to Sudan as a private citizen and negotiate with the president of Sudan, Bashir, to have a unilateral ceasefire to allow the rebel groups to have a political unification so they can negotiate with him. And Governor Richardson agreed to that, and then he started calling some of his friends to raise money for the jet, because nobody wants to fly commercial to Khartoum. And one of these guys was Danny Abraham, who was one of the individuals that gave me money for my project. And Danny told Governor Richardson on the phone, I'll give you money for your jet, but there's this kid, Bergman. You should take him with you. And so, Margarita, I get a phone call on a Wednesday morning, and there's this gruff voice on the other side. Is this Mickey Bergman? I said, yes, it is. It's like, this is Governor Bill Richardson of New Mexico. I need you to pack your stuff and get your ass to Santa Fe. You're coming with me to Khartoum. And not only did I not know Governor Richardson, I didn't know the man existed. And I had 48 hours to figure out whether this is an opportunity of a lifetime or whether this is this last mistake I make before my head gets separated from my body. Because I'm not only Israeli, I'm at that point an Israeli officer in reserves, and Sudan and Israel, not best friends. And I consulted with some of my colleagues at the Clinton Global Initiative, including Dennis Ross and Rob Malley, and of course with my wife, and we decided that I will go to Santa Fe out of respect. I will have lunch with the governor, and then I'll explain to him why it is dangerous and nicely, respectfully bow out from the mission. And so I went to Santa Fe, did that, had lunch with him. Then I said, hey, Governor, can I talk to you on the side a little bit? He said, yeah, of course. And I said, look, I need you to understand, like, not only am I Israeli. I'm Israeli officer in reserves. If things go bad, they go bad really quickly for me, and I don't want to risk the mission. So I think it's best that I don't join you. And he just looked at me and he's like, no, Mickey, I vouched for you already. I told the Sudanese that I know you for 6 years. If they have a problem with you, they have a problem with me, and we're all leaving. And then he looked at me and he had this silly smile on his face. That's the 6-year-old kind of. And he's like, Mickey, do you know what I'm famous for? I said, what is that, Governor? He says, I get people out of jail. So worst comes to worst, you spend a couple of months in the Sudanese jail. Think what it will do to your career. And he's laughing while he's saying that. And at that moment, I realized I have to go with this guy. And so the next thing my wife knows is that she hears me on the cell phone and there's jet engines, noise in the back. And I'm saying, I have to go with this guy. And I went with him. And I saw firsthand the power of non-government actors and their ability to influence somebody else's behavior. And from that point, I was hooked completely. So that's how I started and worked on this.
Wow. Isn't it crazy how you just need to be in the right place at the right time and something can shape out for you in a way you wouldn't have ever imagined? None of that was up to you, really. All you had to do was show up.
I know. Margarita, you hear a lot of people saying when they're interviewed, how do you consider yourself lucky? And most people say yes. Most of the time is luck. But I do define luck in a very specific way. Luck is not just, I'm lucky I won the lottery. Luck is your ability to keep your eyes open and recognize opportunities when they're there and be prepared and take advantage of them. And so, yes, it is so many of these things. It just happened to be that when we came back from Khartoum and that visit, Governor Richardson decided to go and run for president. It was a short attempt in the primaries. In 2007, early, he was competing with Hillary Clinton and one unknown Senator, Barack Obama. And at the time, I was so blown away by what I've seen in Sudan with him. And there was an Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, who was being held hostage by Hamas in Gaza. Back in the days, we only had one. And I figured out within my connections, I had my connections to the Israeli Prime Minister. I had a close colleague and friend, Rob Malley, who had connections directly to Hamas. And I had somebody like Bill Richardson with the gravitas of a presidential candidate. And I wrote a memo. That was my chutzpah. I wrote a memo to the governor titled The 6 Steps You Will Take in Order to Rescue Gilad Shalit. And I gave it to him. It was a 1.5 pages memo. I gave it to him to Governor Richardson in one of his campaign speeches. And he called me the next morning. He said, Mickey, this is a good idea. I said, thank you, Governor. He says, now go do it. I said, me? I wrote it for you. He's like, Mickey, I'm running for president. I don't have time. You staff it. I back you up. And I spent the next 18 months diving into the middle of the mediation between Israel and Hamas, indirect, of course, to work towards the deal that eventually brought Gilad Shalit back home, even though we did not conclude it because those negotiations took all of 5 years. We were in it for about 1.5 years, established the parameters. But early on, the Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert, refused to actually do the deal. And so it fizzled. And then when Bibi Netanyahu got back into power, he decided to do the same deal that was already available before.
This is very interesting because now I feel like the criticism that Bibi gets is he's not serious about taking deals. But in this context, he was the politician that made the deal happen. It was the other politician that didn't want the deal. So it's just interesting.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you think about it from that perspective, but what you said is actually really key. Bibi Netanyahu, first and foremost, is a politician. And at the time of the Gilad Shalit deals, and of course there's much more nuances in it because we've done things with Ehud Olmert that made the deal slightly more digestible. For instance, we had Ehud Olmert release women and children and Hamas parliamentarians, not to Hamas, but release them to Fatah on the side, outside of the deal, even though they were on the list of what Hamas wanted for Gilad Shalit. But by that, he just removed them from the equation. So it made the deal a little bit easier. Still, it was a very tough deal. This was 1,100 Palestinian prisoners. But for the same reasons that Bibi made that deal, because of political calculations, is the same reason why Bibi is not making the deal over the hostages we have in Gaza.
This is actually something very hard, I think, for the average person to understand. What we see in the news is severe information asymmetry than what is actually happening.
And so when the average person opines, you should take the deal, our priority should be the hostages, or no deal at any cost until we destroy Hamas. It's like, well, you don't actually know. You literally do not know, because this could be a save 100, kill 1,000, or this could be kill 100, save 1,000,000. Like we really don't know what the ethical dilemmas are.
Yeah, and look, I've been doing this work now for almost 19 years. And of the many things I've learned, one of the consistent themes is the fact that this world is not black and white. It's all shades of gray. It's not good versus evil. There is good and evil in each and every one of us. Circumstances bring out different elements of it. And most importantly, it's about clashing of values. There is never a silver bullet that fits. That's the right thing to do, the moral thing to do. No, it's complicated. And you have to make a value-based assessment of every single decision and every single deal. I'll tell you, on October 7th, I woke up like so many other Jews in the United States, a little bit late into what was already happening in Israel. Of course, I had my own personal trauma through this, because these were the units that were sent to reinforce are the same units that I worked with when I was in service. It's different people, of course, I'm old, but it's the same units. When I saw them on TV going in, rushing in, I could smell the smells. I could hear the sound. It was the closest I've ever been to a PTSD. And what brought me back from it was a phone call from Leah Goldin. Leah Goldin is the mother of Hadar Goldin, who was killed by Hamas an hour after the ceasefire in 2014, and his body is still held. And I've been working with Leah for years, trying to get Hadar's remains back home for burial. And she called me on October 7th, and she said, Mickey, you know how nobody was listening to me for 10 years. Now everybody's calling me. And she was getting hundreds of phone calls from families. At this point, we didn't know hostages, not hostages, but missing Israelis, asking her for help. And she asked me, can I send them your way? And I said, absolutely. And so within 24 hours, I had over 60 families that already have made contact and asked us to help. I snapped out of my own trauma into this and just into work. And the first thing we had to do was figure out, what is the theory of return? What is the script, the story, the shortest way in which a hostage comes home? And in this case, we based it on three assumptions. The first one was that Hamas and Israel, of course, don't talk directly, so it has to be mediated by a third party. Number two, that there are 4 countries or 4 governments in the region that can influence Hamas. None of them can control Hamas. Very important to remember. But they can influence it. Hamas is a very proud Palestinian independent program. Those countries are Iran, Turkey, Egypt, and Qatar. As you can imagine, none of them have any interest in doing favors to Israel. But at least 2 of them, Qatar and Egypt, have a vested interest in helping and working with the US. Therefore, our theory of return was, 1, we had to make this an American priority, an American story at the presidential level as soon as possible, because that is what the mediators will respond to. Once we did that, then the mediators, Qatar and Egypt, will go to Hamas, will solicit from them what are the hostage proposals, how do we solve the hostage situation, not for Israel, but for the United States. And if, that's the third part, if these proposals are even half decent, and they're never good, they always suck, they're bad, but even if they're half decent, or at least not existentially threatening the state of Israel, then the American president will work with the Israeli prime minister to provide him whatever he needs to feel comfortable enough to sign and implement and execute these deals. That was the theory of return. And it worked extremely well in perspective of my business for the first 54 days, because the average time of getting a political prisoner home is about 2.5 years. Here in 54 days, more than 100 hostages were returned within an agreement. The first part was that the Qataris actually went to Hamas and said, we need a proof of concept before we even get proposals. And Hamas released 2 American women from the Chicago area without anything in return, just to prove the concept, to prove that the channel works. And in 54 days, it worked really well. And since then, we have failed miserably, since that first deal was stopped by Israel. And when I say failed, it's because we have failed to create the right levers and incentives for Bibi Netanyahu to actually go ahead with that deal. I often tell families when I speak to them that, yes, Hamas is the reason why we have hostages. Hamas is the reason why they're in Gaza. But the person who is not making a decision to bring them home in this deal is Bibi Netanyahu. And that's where I had my own value base. Again, as you said, there's a price to pay for this, and it's a terrible price. But in my calculation, my value judgment on this was that nothing in the proposal, in this three-step proposal, which is really the same proposal that was on the table since December and still is until at least yesterday, and I believe will continue to be even after Sinwar's death, there's nothing in that proposal that is existentially threatening the state of Israel. Therefore, it is the responsibility of the state of Israel to do it, get our people back home, and then once they're home, to figure out what is right for Israel as an independent, sovereign country, what is right for them to do for their own security moving forward. Because at the end of the day, the deal you're making here is not with respectful organization. You're making it with Hamas. And if anybody thinks there's an element of it, they want to end the war, they will rearm again. Every single agreement, there's a condition that the end of the war is conditioned on the fact that nobody's rearming. Now, as we're sitting here and people are listening to the podcast and myself too, nobody should have any doubt that Hamas will rearm. But them rearming is a violation of the agreement that they themselves signed, which means that Israel at that point is free to do whatever is needed, except that we don't have the hostages anymore.
So this is the leading theory I heard about why we should take the deal. The counter arguments that I've seen against it on the side of the fence that claims that it's a bad deal is that any concession on Hamas's existence is an existential threat to Israel, is the argument. Whether that's a strong argument, whether that's a valid argument, that's why it's an argument, because it can be argued. But that's the counter theory.
Correct.
And my understanding is at this point, to an outsider, it very much feels like at some point bringing the hostages home was our priority. But it's definitely not priority number one today. At best, it is priority number two. Priority number one is to eliminate Hamas, and any hostages that we return as a result of that is just an added bonus, meaning that becomes a secondary interest and not the primary interest of the current affairs.
Yeah, and I will add the criticism that you said. Yes, indeed, that's one of the biggest criticisms. There's an added value, an additional part of the criticism is actually the Gilad Shalit, the same Gilad Shalit deal that I worked on before, because that deal established a ratio that sounded completely outrageous for everybody, 1,100 prisoners for one soldier. And it was an extremely controversial deal, especially since one of those 1,100s prisoners who were released was Yahya Sinwar, who headed Hamas and orchestrated October 7th. And I faced that a lot. And I love talking about this because to me, it's very important to understand, and that goes back to your general question. The problem with the Gilad Shalit deal was not the actual deal. That was the only deal that was there to be made in order to save a soldier that Israel had the responsibility to retrieve. Again, it wasn't a savory deal. The ratio is completely off. They know that Israel cares more about human lives than Hamas. That's why they can go for that ratio. The problem was not with the deal. The problem was not that Sinwar was released amongst with 1,100 other Palestinian prisoners. The problem was after we got Gilad Shalit back, Israel did not do what traditionally Israel does, which is we got our people back. Now we're going to turn around and we're going to make sure that every single person involved in messing up with an Israeli is punished, whether they see jail back again or whether they have to be eliminated, they get eliminated because it's a terrorist organization. You don't always have the ability to take people in. That is where deterrence is made. Deterrence is made once we have our people back and we deploy every single element that we can do. Now, Israel used to do it in the past, didn't do it after the Shalit deal, and now is back to doing it. Now, here's the distinction here, and it's true about Hamas and the hostages in Gaza. It's true about American political prisoners elsewhere in the world. If we argue that negotiating for the release or making a deal for the release of our innocent people is going to damage our deterrence and therefore we don't do it, that means that we are keeping our own hostages hostage. We have to first get them out and then figure out a deterrence policy that is not on the backs of innocent people being held. And I think that to me, it's as clear as sun. And I trust the joke in Israel is that we're looking at in the last, especially in the last couple of months or last month, after a long year of feeling beaten up, that the Israeli intelligence and security forces have proven the operational competency of James Bond, coupled with the leadership competency of Johnny English. And that is, to me, that's the devastating part of what I struggle with, because the competency, the operational competency that the Mossad and that the Shabak and that the special units in the IDF has proven and provided Israel with after being surprised and beaten up a year ago, should be leveraged by the political leadership to improve Israel's position both in the region and in the world. And we're doing exactly the opposite.
I think you make a really powerful point about don't gain leverage off the backs of innocent people that you're responsible for being held hostage.
Yeah.
This is a point I haven't heard before, and I think it's a very important thing to articulate. And if more people understood that, I think there could be more common ground in how people view what's going on. A separate question for you. Considering you and I both live in America, one of the things you mentioned earlier is the importance of framing this issue as an American issue, especially as it pertains to the hostages that are still to this day held captive that are American citizens. But in the public eye, unfortunately, this sure as hell is not an American issue. And if anything, we're seeing a lot of criticism of the Biden-Harris administration that they're doing too much to help Israel. And then we see on the other side criticism that Biden-Harris are not doing enough to help. And the criticism around, well, you told us not to go into Rafah, but because we went into Rafah, we killed Sinwar. You're a hypocrite. You can't say that the U.S. helped with that success. Like, we did it despite you, not because of you. So we've got these two camps. But I think by and large, I think there may be 6 remaining hostages still that are considered American citizens. 7. Okay.
Yeah. There are 7 Americans currently held in Gaza. 3 of them, unfortunately, are confirmed dead. 4 of them are presumed alive.
Okay. So of these individuals that still remain, I don't think it is perceived as an American issue. And I wonder what your thought on that is.
Yeah, and it's an extremely painful and timely question, because you're right. And one of the things for us and for me personally in all this, once I concluded that I'm going to continue failing at convincing Bibi or creating the conditions for Prime Minister Netanyahu to accept the larger deal, I couldn't just sit back and let the hostages die, because there's 2 cardinal truths about hostage negotiations. The first one is that the deals never get better over time. They just don't. If anything, they get worse. The second cardinal truth is that time is the worst thing that can ever happen to prisoners or to hostages, because at any given point, at any given day, disease, violent act, or taking your own life can and will happen. And in Gaza, we've seen it, unfortunately. And so you can't just sit back. There's a sense of urgency, because every night that you and I in the United States have dinner with our families and go to sleep is a night that these hostages might die in a dungeon somewhere. And so I did the only thing I could figure out how to break this stalemate, and that is claim that there is a deal to bypass the resistance from the Prime Minister that is the responsibility of the President of the United States, because yes, there are Israelis, but they are his constituencies. There are American hostages in there, 7 of them. That's big enough and good enough for the President of the United States to pursue other avenues if the main one is not gaining traction. And I, by the way, on the side, argue that as soon as the pathway to get Americans home, hostages home from Gaza becomes credible, it might be the one thing that will change Bibi Netanyahu's position and get him to go to the bigger deal, because politically it's not feasible for the Prime Minister of Israel to sit on the side and see how the President of the United States is rescuing 7 hostages without him. And I've started pursuing that. And of course, I cannot talk about the details of it, but part of it was to remind, and I published about this at Foreign Policy about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, the details of why this is feasible and why it is important to do it. on October 7th, President Biden's reaction in the first few weeks was not politics. That was his DNA. President Biden is most likely the last American Zionist president. And that is something to keep in mind. And again, Zionist in a way that he is in his DNA, in his years of his existence, he believes that Israel is the homeland for the Jewish people. And that
this is literally heartbreaking to hear.
His last one? That his last one? Yeah, look, it's possible that there will be another Zionist president show up, but right now, the two candidates, and again, I have my own opinion of who I support, but neither of them, both of them are supportive of Israel. Neither of them are Zionists. And Jews understand the difference between the two. You can be supportive of Israel, but it doesn't mean that you're a Zionist. And so Biden's response was in his DNA. And yes, he got a lot of criticism for it. And at the same time, as he is a Zionist, Biden can't stand Prime Minister Netanyahu. I know that firsthand. I've been with Biden when he was vice president in the days when he was going to visit Bibi Netanyahu. I know how much he doesn't trust the guy. And that just accelerated in the last several years, and certainly in the last year and a half. So he's been trying to figure out how does he support Israel as a country and as the homeland of the Jewish people while putting constraints on Prime Minister Netanyahu. And in this case, you get beaten up by both sides for, as you said, not doing enough or doing too much. And that's, again, I wish there was a remedy for that, but comes with the job of being the president, especially in tough situations like this. I think that there is in the political environment, and again, it's probably pretty clear where I stand politically, but it's irrelevant for my work. There is a fear in the Jewish community, a justified fear of the anti-Semitism that exists both in the left and in the right. And anybody who tries to minimize one of these threats is not seeing reality. These are real threats for the Jewish community. The damage that has been done over the last year and a half for the stance of the Jewish community here and its relationships with different minorities and different groups is substantial, and it will outlast the war in Israel. We have a marathon here that we need to gear up, and the way to deal with it is actually to double down in establishing these same traditional relationships that we've had here, even if the groups that we're trying to establish it with seem not to be our allies right now. But we have to engage. The answer is not to disengage. The answer is to engage. But as a Jew, and as a Jew with a family that came from Europe and escaped the Holocaust, I have a strong sense that, yes, the anti-Semitism that we see on the margins of the progressive movement, which is real, whether it's the Muslim community, whether it's the pro-Palestinian community. And by the way, I side comment, I digress here. I'm a progressive person. It's always been my basic calculation that a Palestinian statehood is in the best interest of Israel. I believe that as Jews, controlling another peoplehood is bad. And I think we're all living through the consequences of that in what it does to us. Forget about what it does to the people that we control. That same community that I belong to, after October 7th, basically threw me out. Not because of the substance of what I have to say, but because of who I am in terms of heritage. And yes, it's a real thing. It's not because they're a bunch of anti-Semites. Most of them are not. But they're susceptible to some of the misinformation that get fed. And then it stays there. However, and this is a big however. Sorry, I hope I'm not confusing everybody with this. But it's a big however. If there is to be a second Holocaust in the United States, it will not be done by a Muslim minority. It will be done by the neo-Nazis. And they are not in that side. They're on the other side. And will anti-Semites from the left be able to hurt Jews? Absolutely. They have. They will, unfortunately, continue to. But the systemic targeting of the Jewish community in the United States, if it happens, I think it will not, and I hope it will not. But if it does happen, it comes from more traditional white supremacist Christian side of the map there. And since that is an existential threat, that is where my eyes are at.
How do you know that this is true?
I don't know that it's true.
This is your belief?
this is my belief, and I have to be honest about this. My experiences, because of my heritage and my family and my upbringing, is very subjective to understanding a threat. Because the experience of, if I compare this experience to this experience of Israelis in Israel over the last 13 months, they will say, no, you're wrong. It's going to be the radical Islamic terrorists who are going to do the most harm. And I can't deny the fact that I'm not objective in my views on this. Like everybody, we have our decisions and our evaluations are made based on our experiences. So I can't claim that I know it as a fact. It is the best of my analysis, and that's what I'm operating on.
So my opinion on this, albeit not a super valuable one or not a super influential opinion, is just how I feel, is, to me, I can't say which party it would be or which fringe of the party it's going to be. But what I can say is, to me, the side that would be successful in doing some kind of a crime against Jewish people, hopefully never to the degree of the Holocaust, but in that vein, is the party for whom the administration normalizes this behavior. If it becomes a cultural normalization across that fringe group, where they're not viewed as a social pariah, where they're not viewed as a disgrace to society, as crazy people, that will be the successful group. And for me, the neo-Nazis are very much viewed as a social pariah in society. They're viewed as crazy. We all know they're crazy. They're people who are obsessed with guns. They game all day and play shooting games. Like, what kind of person does that all day? We all know in our gut that feels wrong. And so when we encounter those people, we're like, we're never going to allow that. They're crazy. But on the left, we have yet to see the shift. We have yet to shame and to call a disgrace the 18-year-old students at Columbia that are barricading buildings and asking for humanitarian aid, unironically. And the only way to prevent the left from becoming more of a threat than what you feel the right is by stopping the normalization of this behavior. We need to start making them a disgrace to society. That's my opinion.
And I think you framed it really well. I agree with that. I will make one side comment, and that is that while you and I clearly look at the neo-Nazis as crazies and not normalized, within the current presidential campaign, I believe they are being normalized. But your framing is correct about this in terms of the normalization of it or the pushing it of saying this is not who we are, period, as people. Yeah, I agree with that. But again, we digressed a lot from hostage negotiations, huh?
Yes, and I want to digress further by talking to you about emotional intelligence and resilience, which is also a big part of your work.
Yeah.
What comes to mind is you've been doing high stress, high stakes negotiation for decades at this point. You have covered every major hostage negotiation and release in modern history, like Paul Whelan, Brittney Griner, Otto Warmbier, Gilad Shalit, every single major event, you have been there and you have worked on it. How do you think that emotional intelligence and resilience has helped you go through life while also working on something that is so high stress and high importance?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, I have to say that being an Israeli male, emotional intelligence is not exactly our famous brand. I had to acquire that in life. And I think that I do, even though I give a huge amount of credit to Bill Richardson as teaching me about half of what I know in terms of negotiations, the other half, the half of the emotional intelligence, comes from my wife. I've learned it from her. And it wasn't easy lessons. Sometimes they were a little painful. But I do find emotional intelligence as the key, not only in managing and handling the high stakes of what I'm doing, but they're actually the tool of negotiations that I use. Because, again, I don't work for a government. So I don't have a leverage that governments do. Most of the leverage that I use in negotiations is emotional. And for that, I have to deploy the very basic contours of emotional intelligence, the 4 different planes. The first one is self-awareness. So knowing emotionally where you are, what you're bringing into a conversation. So having that awareness. Once you have that awareness, the second plane is being able to manage it in real time. The third plane is being able to be develop awareness of where and what emotions other side is bringing into these conversations. And once you have that awareness, the fourth plane is being able to manage the relationships accordingly. In other words, I look at negotiations and everything that we do not as the actual transaction that takes place at the end, but I look at negotiations more of our ability to influence the way somebody else is making decisions. And the emotional elements of it are huge. And it's not just about, oh yeah, I'm going to pretend to be their best friend and then they're going to like me and they're going to do me a favor. That's not what this is about. This is an extremely simplistic view of what it is. It is genuinely to understand how they look at the world, how they see themselves in it. And based on that, realize what are the different levers that you can pull in order to influence the decision that they're making. I can give you tons of examples on that, including from Hamas and the way they see negotiations. I've learned through my work of how the North Koreans understand the world and their role in it. And once you understand and accept that, then you can figure out what is doable with them and what is not, what is realistic and what is not, and how to get there. Same goes with the Russians. Somebody has, and you yourself, you said your heritage is from Ukraine. Unless you understand how the Russians view it, and it doesn't mean you agree with it, but unless you understand the narrative of what they're telling themselves and what they believe in order to explain what is happening, you will not be able to influence how they make decisions. And when I work on the Russians, on getting Trevor Reed home, or Taylor Dudley, or Brittney Griner, or Paul Whelan, or I still have 4 other Americans that I'm working on who are still in Russia, hopefully will come home soon. Unless I take the time, spend time with the Russians and understand where they are emotionally on this, if I don't do that, I won't be able to get anywhere with them, which is very similar to why the governments can't get anywhere with them, because governments are not very good at doing that. So that's on the negotiation side of it, and it's really important. And the main reason I wrote my book was not just to tell the stories and behind the scenes in all of these negotiations, but hopefully that through the stories, the readers get a sense of that layer of negotiations that we completely miss, which is the human one. It's that human interaction, that emotional interaction through it. On a personal level, going back to your question, I have to use a lot of self-awareness to know where I'm at emotionally, and also to know when I need to step away, because it is very easy to slide into a emotionally burn zone, not recognizing that's where you're at, and then you make tragic mistakes that the very least will cost me, but more importantly, they might cost somebody else's life or months or years of their in captivity. And so having that ability to recognize that, having tools to diffuse it when it happens is extremely important. And I think in each of our lives, I know I talk about high-stake negotiations, but it's true about our daily lives. How often can you remember moments in which somebody did something that just triggered you emotionally and you reacted immediately to that? And in that reaction, you're not making things better for yourself. You're making things worse, but you couldn't stop. And that period is really from the moment that your body senses a certain emotion, and it's a nerve. So it's a physical sensation that gets translated into an emotion in the back of our brains. And then it takes a split second for it to come to the front of our brains where the logical process takes place. But in that time between, when we react, we are reacting in what is called being emotionally hijacked, because you're reacting out of your emotions, not out of the logic, and you might make huge mistakes while you do it. And that's where it sounds like a cliche, but just take a stop, count to 3 before you respond. That's in order to have that time to process. I'll say that there is a great video, anybody who's listening, it's worth watching, and that is the US Open tennis tournament. So you can't blame me that I'm talking all about hostages here. Serena Williams against Naomi Osaka. That was Naomi Osaka's first final. Okay, I believe it was 2017, and they're playing, and these are like fantastic players. The umpire calls on Serena Williams, claiming that she received coaching, which is illegal, and punishes her, give her a warning. Serena, whose daughter is in the audience, gets extremely offended of the accusation of the umpire, because she says, I've never received coaching. By the way, she didn't, but that's neither here nor there. And she starts arguing with the umpire. And as she's arguing, she's completely emotionally hijacked. and he keeps punishing her, and it's costing her points and points, and it cost her the game. She lost the championship for that. It's a tremendous video, and you can find it on YouTube, of seeing somebody emotionally hijacked, which means that they're acting and reacting against their best interest. And then it's not over, because then you skip 20 minutes ahead. The game is over. They're the award ceremony. And you have Serena Williams, you have Naomi Osaka, and whoever is facilitating this, and they're about to give the gifts. And 20,000 people in the audience. And the crowd is booing. 20,000 people booing because they were with Serena on this. And the interviewer is asking Serena a question, and she sees all these like booing. And of course, it's empowering because they're supporting her. But on the side, and you can see it in the video, in the side of her eyes, she suddenly notices Naomi Osaka, a 17-year-old girl who just won her first Grand Slam. And she has her visor down and she's crying. Because at her most important moment, 20,000 people are booing. And Serena does one of the most exceptional transitions I've ever seen in my life on emotional intelligence. She does a double take. She realizes what's happening. She takes the microphone and she says, I'm going to answer your question later, but now I want to talk to the audience. And she says, we will all have to process what just happened here. But right now, I want everybody to stop booing, because this young lady next to me has won their first major tournament. She's a champion. She's a fantastic player. And she turned around 20,000 people in an instant who started cheering for Naomi Osaka. And this is at the time that Serena was hurting. She was offended. She lost the championship. And it's just the most powerful emotional intelligence transition that I've ever witnessed. I actually use it in my Georgetown class to teach.
I think this is a great example of, do you want to be right or do you want to win?
Correct.
And I think Serena chose that she wanted to be right in this situation, that her best interest was to be right as opposed to win the tournament. And each time we have a situation like that, we have an opportunity to decide for ourselves.
You're right. You're right about that. And again, taking it back to hostage negotiations for a second, so often we have an opportunity to punch the captors, the people who have the people that we want, whether it's in an argument or embarrassing them through something or physically get to them. And you have to ask the same question. Do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? And for me, it's important to stay, because my job is one. My job is to get people home. For me, is to make sure that I'm like a horse with blinders. Like the only thing that I need to do is get those people home. We can deal with the consequences after, whatever they are.
100%. Thank you so much for imparting your wisdom on me. I learned a tremendous amount in this conversation, just an enormous amount. How can people connect with you on social media and learn more about your work?
First of all, social media, pretty easy. On X, I'm at Mickey Bergman, spelled like the mouse, Mickey Bergman. On Instagram, Mickey.Bergman. Again, pretty simple. The organization that I run now is called Global Reach, and you can find it online at reach.global, no .com, just reach.global. Hopefully people want to read the book. It's called In the Shadows, and it's available on everywhere, both hard copies and audio. And yeah, I'm around. I give talks. I love this stuff. Obviously, you can tell that I love talking about it.
Next time you're in New York, you got to let me know so I can come hear you speak.
Will do.
And I have one final question for you. It's one that I ask every single guest. Who would you like to nominate for People Jew Want to Know podcast?
So I would say I thought about that question before, and the person that I would recommend, her name is Marlene Goldberg. I just saw her yesterday. She is a lawyer. She's a Jewish lawyer here in Washington, D.C. It's not only that she's a leader in a lot of the legislation that is going on around campuses now with the protests, but also in ways of finding ways to deter companies that inadvertently are supporting terrorism. She does that by making new laws, which is a term that I've learned from her, of lawyers who are activists, who take existing law and apply it in different circumstances, and by winning trials like that, actually make impact beyond just the case that they're serving. She is a brilliant mind. And one of the voices, I think, if you look at the Jewish leadership, upcoming Jewish leadership, highly recommend having her.
Thank you very much. This is a fantastic nomination, and it has been truly an honor to speak with you today.
Thank you, Marguerite. I really appreciate it.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please go ahead and rate us 5 stars. Be the first to hear our episodes by subscribing to People Jew Want to Know wherever you get your podcasts. And for exclusive content, follow us on Instagram at People Jew Want to Know.